Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time for part 3 of my story crafting series. Today we're going to be talking about characters. Characters are very important. People are always very interested in their characters. I always talk about 3 big things whenever I'm talking about what creates a story. The first one is setting. That's sort of the world that the story takes place in. The second one is characters. Characters occupy that setting and act within it. And the third one is plot. Plot is sort of the order of events. And that order of events is usually executed by the characters. So the characters are very important. You have setting leading to characters, leading to the execution of the events, aka the plot. Let's dig into characters. I'm going to give a big overview. The next one, of course, is going to end up being plot. So this is an overview of character design, and we'll dig into some specifics later on, probably in response to what you happen to think about this particular subject when you inevitably comment and tell me how I'm wrong and tell me how I'm right. I'm always appreciative of any kind of feedback. So let's remember our setting that we talked about last time, our little medieval fantastical Welsh setting with dragons and wizards and knights and all sorts of fun things. Contained within your setting are all the things that you need to have your story operate. You have your building materials, you have your buildings, you have your natural artifacts such as dragons, you have rocks, you have also within that setting the roles that the characters are going to occupy. So the characters are born out of the setting. Their place within the setting it determines how that character is going to think, act, feel, and operate within the plot. So you have some bandits, you have some soldiers, you got a wizard, and of course you have damsels in towers along with knights. What's important to understand when we're talking about characters is that all of these guidelines that I talk about in any of these videos, these are just sort of suggestions. These aren't hard and fast rules. You could always break those rules to varying effects. I said before that it's probably not realistic that you're going to have like a libertarian revolution in Song Dynasty China, but you can attempt to write that story, and it might be interesting to see what in that culture could give birth to 18th century onward sort of liberty ideas. But generally speaking, the more you are impressing ideas that are outside of that setting, the more you're going to sort of ruin the immersion that your reader might be, or viewer, if you're happening to be making a movie or something else, that they might be experiencing through the action. So let's very quickly, I'm going to talk a little bit about characters. As I said before, they are born from the setting. Their attitudes and their beliefs are in line with their environment. And also they're going to have roles and occupy casts that are in line with their environment. What that really means is, I'll talk about one specific example. If we go back to our wonderful little Welsh setting, we have a damsel in a tower looking very much like a medieval damsel with a little, some sort of a headdress and a low-cut shirt. Women obviously are going to have particular roles in particular cultures, and if you're writing in a fantasy setting, they might end up with a different role than men will have because they are physically different than men. So men tend to do more of the dangerous physical labor, like being soldiers, and women tend to do more of the labor that is involved around the household because, you know, especially in a medieval setting, they will be dealing with numerous children and will not have time to go off soldiering while they're caring for those children. So if we have a character that tends to break that mold, we have a knight maybe that happens to be female. Well, we really have to spend a lot of time world building and justifying how that character is breaking that mold and what the consequences are of that character sort of pushing back against that particular caste that's part of the setting. So the roles that the characters occupy, that becomes a central part of their outlook on their own environment and their setting, which is in turn going to affect the order of the plot and the way that the plot is executed. It's not that you can't have characters that don't fulfill their normal roles. It's just that is going to be part of the conflict, and that's going to in turn control the execution of plot and all the other characters' attitudes toward this character. Because if we have our wonderful female knight, well, all the other soldiers are going to think that might be a little bit odd because they're used to women occupying a different role, right? So it's not that you can't break those roles, but generally speaking, if you're operating in an environment that has the strict roles, you need to observe them. A good counterexample to this is Malazan Book of the Fallen, which doesn't really treat gender roles with any kind of significant anything. It just kind of glosses over them. So there's female soldiers and whatever else, and it's never really brought up. So we kind of presume that in that particular example, there are no strict gender roles. Gender roles are fluid, and the sex of the characters becomes mostly like an aesthetic choice, and doesn't always affect the progress of the book. Not always, but there are some that definitely do that within the Malazan series. The other thing about characters that I said is they do drive the plot forward with their action. Characters are the ones who execute the plot. The plot is not usually executed upon characters, though you could attempt to do this. Like I said, these are always guidelines. You could have a character who the entire story is him, surviving a series of calamities happening through him. But even so, his actions are the ones that are overcoming those calamities. So usually his actions are going to be the ones that drive the plot forward. Now, this is an important one, is that characters usually have wills and desires that have definitive failure states related to the plot. What that means is that a character is going to have a goal, and the fail state of that particular goal is going to be what is at risk in the plot. So if the goal is to survive, then obviously death is the failure state. Death is usually always a failure state, but I guess you could write stories there where death is not the failure state. So not only do we have death being a failure state, but let's say, if you imagine a story with Superman, the failure state in Superman is Superman failing to protect the innocents. If your goal is the character to take over the country and he fails to do it, then he's achieved the failure state. And that's the risk within the conflict. So characters always have desires that have failure states related to the plot. If their desires are not related to the plot, then they usually are going to feel out of place in any kind of given story. Okay? Let's talk about three different kinds of characters. We have, your three basic types. You have a protagonist, which is a character that the audience wishes to succeed at whatever goals they happen to be doing. You have antagonists. Antagonists they don't have to be a character, but if they are a character, it's a character that's going to be in opposition to the protagonist. So they have their own goals, and those goals are going to be in opposition to the protagonist, either passively or actively. And the third kind is really secondary characters. A secondary character is anything that their goals are not necessarily related to the main goals. They're not controlling the failure state of the story directly. They're either allied with the protagonist or allied with the antagonist, or neutral, or are involved in some progression of the plot, but their goals are not specifically related to the failure state of the overall goal of the story. Okay, so I call those secondary characters. Other people have other names for them. I tend not to use static characters for sort of NPC-like characters because secondary characters can have their own growth curve. So let's quickly talk about the protagonist, and we'll talk about growth curves. A protagonist, most people think of the protagonist as the main character, and that's really not a bad way to think about it. It's the character that the audience really wants to succeed, and it's the character that usually the writer's going to focus most on, but that's not always the case. You can have a book that's written from the perspective of one character, but is focusing on another that happens to be the protagonist. There doesn't have to be one protagonist, by the way. I mentioned Malazan Book of the Fallen. That's a great example of a book with many, many protagonists, sometimes dozens of protagonists. There is no main character. There's just a field of characters with their own goals, desires, wants that are essentially affecting the plot. And any character that has desires or wants that aren't part of that particular story and plot, they're usually not going to receive treatment within a particular book. Usually we have this idea that protagonists need to grow in order to achieve their goal. So they have a goal, and the conflict is them wanting to achieve the goal, and there are things standing in their way. And they usually have to grow in some capacity to overcome those obstacles and then achieve their goal. Either they grow morally, or they grow physically, or they grow intellectually, or they come to some greater understanding about themselves and their environment that allows them to achieve their goal, or to alter their goal in a way that's going to make it achievable. There's a lot of different ways that growth curves can occur, but most people, I think, go into a story expecting some kind of growth with the character. Just as an example, if you think of Star Wars, if you think of the first Star Wars movie, or you could think of the entire trilogy, or either of the trilogies, really. you have Luke, who starts off as kind of like a peon and nothing. He gets a taste of the Force that he happens to be sensitive in. And at the end of the story, he's able to actually use the Force to slightly alter some torpedoes and save the day. So we have a character that's introduced to a capacity. They have a goal that ends up being kind of like escape from mediocrity. They achieve that goal by being a hero. And of course, their growth is they have to understand their inner strength and then put it to use to achieve the story. Now, likewise, that same character in the next story ends up failing at their particular goals. Their goal becomes to save their friends and to defeat Darth Vader, and he fails at that. And that's sort of like a more tragic flaw kind of story. So the fail state is built into both of those stories, and their goal is usually the primary concern of the story. So the primary goal of the story is usually the same as the primary goal of the protagonist. It doesn't always have to be that case, but that's usually what people are going to expect. So that goal then becomes the primary generator of conflict. Like I said, you have a goal, you want to achieve it, there's something standing in your way. Briefly, I'll talk about two kinds of heroes that I'll address maybe in some bigger videos. The first one is the anti-hero, which is very popular right now. An anti-hero is a protagonist that doesn't represent virtue. In other words, they don't represent what we typically think of virtue. They're not good guys. They may be morally neutral. They may have some different set of morals that's different from ours, or they just may be a person that is not a typical hero at all. They may be a person with base desires, maybe a person who's violent, they may be a person who is cowardly. So there's lots of examples of anti-hero. I think the most classic one people usually think of is Elric from the Elric saga. A lot of people classify him as an anti-hero because he's a character who is driven by all sorts of different goals. Some of them are virtuous and some of them are not. And he takes revenge on people. He's got the black blade that wants to called Stormbreaker that wants to cleave everybody's soul, and he's always in conflict over it. He's a bit of an anti-hero, but there's more recent examples and probably more popular examples. I think of Lestat from the Vampire Chronicles is a great example of an anti-hero. He's not a good guy. He's not driven by some moral quest. He's sort of driven by his own vanity, but we end up really identifying with him because of the way that the character writes, or the way that the author writes the character. We end up really wanting his goals to succeed, even though he's not necessarily a virtuous character. Second one I'll talk about is what I call a paragon character. A paragon character is sort of a type of static character. A paragon character enters a story fully developed. They don't really have an upward growth curve, as we would understand it. They're fully developed, they're like fully adult, and they have goals, and the conflict is really the same thing, but they don't necessarily have a growth curve. You can have paragon characters. I feel like they're fairly popular in a lot of sort of Japanese stories that I get, and you'll find them elsewhere. Basically, you have a character that has a goal and another character who has a goal, and they're in conflict, and the story is really just about the conflict. It's not about them growing up. It's not about them having revelations. It's just about which side will act appropriately to win. Will good and evil win out? So paragon characters are another thing that you may see from time to time. Antagonists, they are basically the villain. That's what most people think of an antagonist is. But it doesn't have to be a character at all. There's like man versus environment stories where the antagonist is like nature or something like that. So you don't have to have a character that's an antagonist. But if you do have a character that's an antagonist, usually they're going to be opposed to the goals of the protagonist, either actively or passively. So if you have your antagonist is a king and the protagonist wants to be king, well, obviously the antagonist wants to stop from losing his throne. He's going to be acting against the goals of the protagonist. So that's what's the conflict, a big part of the conflict. The antagonist, you can think of sort of the actor in the conflict against the goals of the protagonist. So the protagonist is acting towards his goals. The antagonist is acting against his goals. But it doesn't really have to be a bad guy, by the way. So if you have an anti-hero, you may have an antagonist who's probably a pretty good guy, but you may generate something about his character that might make the reader really want him to fail, like he is cowardly or weak, or he doesn't understand something that the anti-hero protagonist understands, and so you really want the anti-hero to succeed. So secondary characters, these are characters that don't directly affect the goals of the plot. They are acting within the plot, they're actors in the plot, but they don't necessarily have their own goals that are specific to the plot, right? Their goals might just, they're not really part of the story. You might have a secondary character who's like a peasant. Obviously, he wants to grow crops and sell them, but he acts when he comes in contact with one of the antagonists or the protagonist. It either helps or harms him, or helps to further the plot in some way, but his goals are not really part of the story itself. So they can be aligned or opposed to the protagonist, and their goals, like I said, are not the focus of the story. A great example is from Lord of the Rings. So Grishnak serves Sauron. His goals are in line with Sauron's. He doesn't have his own goals that are like super intrinsic to the story, that are different from the real antagonist goals, which is Sauron's goals. If he had his own goals, which were to like steal the ring for himself, then we're talking about more of an antagonist or a protagonist character, more of a main character, and not really just some secondary character. Faramir on the other side, he serves Gondor, so like he's really just a servant of those opposing Sauron. He's not his goals are not super intrinsically linked with the main goals of Lord of the Rings: destroy the ring and save Gondor. He doesn't have his own specific goals, so he ends up kind of being a secondary character through most of the books. And secondary characters generally are not expected to have a defined growth curve, meaning they don't have like a moral question that they have to answer. They don't have a personal fault that they have to overcome for the story to move forward. They're acting in the story. They're helping the protagonist. They're helping the antagonist. They're moving the plot forward, but they are not really having to make a lot of personal growth in order for the goals to be achieved of the plot. So they usually are either helping or hindering the antagonist. That's a great way to think about it. If they're doing neither, usually you're not going to want them in your story, right? If a character doesn't serve the plot, probably doesn't need to be in the story, unless it's fulfilling like some other purpose, like to fill out the setting and apply world building. Static characters, I'll talk very briefly about static characters. Static characters are basically anything without a growth curve. Static characters can be main characters, they can be protagonists or antagonists, but they don't grow. So Sauron is a great example. He's just a static bad guy, right? He doesn't necessarily grow or change throughout the course of Lord of the Rings. They don't have to grow to accomplish their goal. Sauron does not have any growing to do. He's basically a godlike figure. There's nothing for him to grow. His goal is to just get his ring back and conquer the world. And like I mentioned, there are Paragon characters. They're fully grown. They're fully developed. They're totally themselves, and they're acting within a conflict, sometimes as a protagonist. Let's very quickly look at our wonderful medieval Welsh setting once again. So now we have a whole cast of characters. We understand their roles. We understand their purposes. If we're imagining that we have a female knight, we're probably going to want her to be the protagonist, because we're focusing on her, and her goals are going to be, to take her pet dragon out and conquer some foreign country, perhaps. What is standing in her way? Well, obviously the society is standing in her way, because female knights are not common. Perhaps her ability to control dragons is what makes up for her lack of physical strength in comparison to the male knights that she is campaigning with. So you have a conflict of acceptance, perhaps. You have a conflict of soldiers against soldiers. And all of that is born from the setting. So all of the characters' attitudes, beliefs, and struggles come out of the setting. They're really very strongly knit together with the setting. Likewise, once those characters have been born out of the setting, they're the ones who are going to act in the furtherment and the fulfillment of the goals of the plot. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I hope it's been interesting. Please leave me your thoughts and let me know about any particulars that you think about with characters. What characters, and I'll leave this question, what characters kind of stay with you. We really like characters. We really like to think about characters as people that we might want to know, people that we might want to talk to. What characters have sort of stuck around with you as being very interesting and very worth discussing, very worth seeing in stories and seeing act and seeing grow? I want to know those, and I want to know what you think about writing in general. So let me know. And don't forget to visit my website, dvspress.com, davidvstewart.com. I always appreciate it, and you have a great, great day, night, whenever you're watching it. Make sure it's great.